Tomorrow, you'll get kind of the first glimpse at why we need reparations. This is a preliminary report. It kind of gives kind of a blueprint of how California can proceed with providing reparations for African Americans and descendants of slaves. But most important, it will, if you read it, you get a chance to really get into it because it's very long and lengthy. It has a lot of testimony that I think some Americans have never heard, some Californians have never heard, and I think it will add to the discussion. It's the preliminary report. I believe it's about 500 pages, so it is full of information and facts that will help us as we move further to the final report that then needs to go to the governor, the legislature for final approval. And hopefully in the final report, we'll come up with some finalized recommendations on how we proceed with reparations. But most important, it will be the first of its kind. California, as usual, is leading the way. And this is the first type of task force of this nature that actually looks at this in a comprehensive way with a diverse group of individuals from the legal field, academics, political, to really delve deeply into this discussion of what does true reparations look like.
So I've read a little bit of that draft report already. I don't know how much detail you can get into it, but some of the ideas on there that caught some attention was this expansion on voter registration, holding police accountable, and improving Black neighborhoods. Those were some of the ones that caught my eye. At least to me, when I look at it, these are kind of ideas I've heard before. So when we talk about this report and some of the ideas of reparations and what we can be expecting, can you kind of expand why some of these, or if not those, some others that you think are particularly interesting?
We've learned that there have been laws, there have been things that have gone on in America that have stifled, impeded, or stopped African Americans from really realizing our full potential. The thing that I usually give is, my uncle was one of the Little Rock Nine, one of the 9 kids that integrated Central High School in 1957, and they were refused access to high school. Think about that. They were refused access to the best all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they bucked that after Brown versus Board of Education that said we should have equal education. I can tell you right now, if it wasn't for those brave 9 kids, which my uncle was one, I would not have had the opportunity to go to USC and on to Harvard, and now I'm back in a doctoral program at USC if it wasn't for their sacrifices. They were beaten, they were kicked, they were called all sorts of names for going to high school. Think about what I'm saying, high school. And that showed that education was a key for African Americans to succeed. And so we had laws in place to impede that. So we need to look at those laws that were put in place that some still have some dramatic impact on what we do now. So that also includes redlining. That also includes our ability to buy a house. We get, when we do appraisals for African Americans, we're not treated fairly. And so we need to delve into all of the harms, because this is really about harms to descendants of slaves. We need to look at those harms so that we can then go back and say, what do we need to reverse those harms so that we can, and my kids, their ancestors, one going forward, will be able to improve their life because we remove these impediments out of the way. And I liken it a lot to if you have a factory that's poisoning the river and it goes downhill and it poisons a community, you not only have to provide reparations, financial, not only do you have to provide remediation to fix the neighborhood, provide medical care, but then you have to stop the pollution that's going through. And this pollution of racism that is flowing through the Black community, needs to stop. And this is our opportunity to show how we can cut off that flow.
Let's talk semantics really quick, because I think people who aren't familiar with this project, maybe it just escaped them while this was ongoing. When they hear the word reparations, they might think of the idea that someone will just be cutting a check at the end of this to people who were impacted. I'm assuming it's more than just that. Is that even something you guys were looking at? It's just something I want to address, since I think some people still have it in their head.
It is not just a check. It has to be more than that. As I've used that river racism, just giving a community money is not the solution. You have to give them other things to make sure they make their community whole. And for this is better education, access to capital, being able to close the earnings gap between African Americans and white people. We just need to be able to stop it. And so for me, the bulk of what we need to do from this point on, yes, we're going to look at whatever financial remuneration needs to be done. But for me, 99% of it is really stopping racism, either through legislation, either through looking at policies and procedures that have been in place over the centuries. We're talking 400 years of oppression on a people. And so to reverse that, we're really going to have to work hard to look at the laws that were put in place to keep us down.
Given that you guys have a 500-page document, this might be the hardest question I ask you, but what do you think is the most significant part of that 500 pages?
I think two things that we need to really delve into and address. One is education, and the other is housing or home ownership. Education, so that we can bring up the next generation of African Americans so they can live the American dream. And I just don't mean just getting a college education. If I had to do it all over, I think I would have become a carpenter. I would make a whole lot more money now than I'm making right now. So it's not only going to college, but it's skilled labor. And then the wealth gap is really about owning a home. That is the biggest part of the wealth gap. Before we can start owning our own businesses, before we start investing in stocks, before we start doing those things that then put us on a whole nother level, at least do the basic wealth generation things that we need to do. And so if it's educating African Americans on how to hold on and retain wealth, that's part education, but it's also part being able to have money management in a way that we can thrive and flourish.
Two more questions for you. My understanding is this is kind of the halfway point for what you guys are doing. To kind of beg the question there, why exactly is it the halfway point? Well, why aren't we there already?
We needed to kind of set the stage. What we've learned through legislation and other things is you have to feed individuals and society as a whole gradually. You just can't thrust this all on them at one time. And so for example, there are people who will tell you that, yes, their ancestors may have participated in the slave trade and their families have benefited, but they didn't do it. And so we have to teach them why it is so important that they become part of this discussion so that we can reverse this. And so it will take a while to get that done. This is the first tranche of that. And I think it's very important that we lay the framework for what we're trying to do, so that as when we come back with some very ambitious reparation goals and objectives, we will have convinced Californians that one, it needs to be done. Two, we're going to show them how we can do reparations. And most important, why it makes sense to do it a certain way. That's probably the most important for it to be able to pass through the legislature and through the governor. But even with historic surpluses, we still have to make that case. And we need time to be able to do that.
And the last question kind of touches on something you had actually mentioned in the first part. We're talking about this idea of California leading the way. It does beg the question, though, because when I think about slavery historically, California is not really the one I think of. It's not in that archetype. So in terms of California leading the way, certainly that's great. But is California really the one to be leading that fight? I guess to kind of rephrase that as a better question is, why California out of any other state? It's not one of the ones you typically associated with slavery back then.
So if you look at California's history, not only with African Americans, but Latinos and Native Americans, we have not been very kind to people of color. And we've had segregated housing. We've had all sorts of laws on the books. We've had governors that have discriminated against folk. And so we got to stop burying our heads in the sand that California wasn't participating. When you read the report, when you read about land that was taken away from thriving African-American communities in California, we hear about Tulsa, but there's been things that have been done in California that are very similar to what was going on in the slave counties. I have a bill called reparations for Juneteenth, and it really talks about how after the war, it took almost 2 years before African Americans in Texas even were told that they were free. A lot of that was going on in California too. And so we really do need to look at some of the laws that were in place that restricted African Americans to live certain places, that restricted who you could marry. You could not marry out of your race here in California. And so the vestiges of slavery that may have started in the South and the East Coast still permeated in California society and became part of law and part of what we did during that time. And so, the report, when you read it, it's so enlightening. It's because when you read what has been done in California against African Americans, it's unbelievably eye-opening.
All right, that wraps it up for my questions. Just to throw it over to you, this report is coming out Wednesday, and some might say it's groundbreaking or historic. As people get the news of this report, what do you want to leave them with in terms of last comments?
I want everyone to join the discussion. So the most important thing is that the task force, the 9 members, we're not the be all and end all. We need all African Americans to participate in the discussion so that we can come up with the best solutions moving forward. We need people who may not be African Americans to participate in the discussion, because some of them may come up with some solutions to this problem that we didn't think about. And this has to be one of those all hands on deck kind of discussion where we get everybody involved so we can come up with the best solutions for California with some innovative ways that we can do reparations. And like I said, it's not all about money, it's about generational change for all African Americans.